Good afternoon in the United States, good evening in Europe, and welcome to this event. I'm Jeff Rathke. I'm the president of the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies at Johns Hopkins University. And we are here today to talk about a crucial emerging technology, artificial intelligence, something that presents technical, entrepreneurial, but also policy questions. And that's why we're very pleased to offer this event on today, the 2-month anniversary of the German government led by Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who was just here in Washington yesterday. And we have representatives from government, from industry, and from the policy sector. And my job right now is to get out of the way and let that happen. But the last thing I want to say is a thank you to our partners, the Heinrich Böll Foundation and their Washington office. And that's where I transition to my colleague in that endeavor, Bastian Hermeson, for a few words before we get started. Bastian.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and welcome also on behalf of the Heinrich Böll Foundation, the German Green Political Foundation. I'm very glad you could join us for this debate and so glad that we could partner with AICGS again in this series of debates. At our foundation, we believe in the great potential of digital technologies to accelerate and shape the socio-ecological transformation of our economies. Like any new technology, artificial intelligence also carries risks to people and the planet. And we believe that it is important to deepen the transatlantic and the global conversation on how to contain such risks, and at the same time, to work together across the Atlantic to reap the benefits of these technologies and to stay competitive as digital democracies, especially in the face of technological competition from China and other actors. In this sense, we hope that this outstanding panel will help learn from one another and create ideas for future transatlantic cooperation and collaboration. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you in particular again to our partners at AICGS, Jeff, Peter, to my colleague Sabine Muscat at our office for putting this together, and over to Peter Rashish from AICGS for moderating this event.
Thank you, Bastian. I'm Peter Rashish. I'm a senior fellow and director of the geoeconomics program at AICGS. Let me also add my welcome to all of you for joining us today for this event on a transatlantic AI innovation agenda, opportunities for the new German government and the United States. As Jeff and Bastian have said, AI is a key emerging technology for the economy and for broader human interaction. And it's one where both sides of the Atlantic are looking for greater ways to innovate and ways also to mitigate privacy concerns and prevent AI risks, and also ways to cooperate to promote shared values and advance their common economic interests. And today we're very delighted to have 3 first-rate speakers who will discuss the state of AI innovation in Germany and the United States and explore opportunities for advancing a transatlantic AI innovation agenda. Dr. Anna Christmann is the federal government coordinator of the digital economy and startups, as well as the federal government coordinator of German aerospace policy. She's been a member of the German Bundestag since 2017, where she is a member of the Committee on Education, Research, and Technology Assessment. And in the previous parliament, she was also a member of the Digital Committee and spokesperson for Innovation and Technology Policy for the Alliance 90, the Greens parliamentary group. From 2018 to 2020, she was the chairwoman of her parliamentary group in the Enquête Commission on Artificial Intelligence. She holds an MA from the University of Heidelberg with a major in political science and minors in economics and mathematics, and she received her PhD in political science from the University of Bern and then worked at the Center for Democracy at the University of Zurich. Dr. Charina Chou leads Google's global public policy strategy for emerging technologies, including artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and health. Prior to Google, Charina served as a White House Fellow in the Office of Science and Technology Policy. Her work has been published in several peer-reviewed journals and recognized with awards from the National Science Foundation and the Materials Research Society. She holds a BS in chemistry from Stanford and a PhD in nanotechnology from UC Berkeley. Tyson Barker is the head of the Technology and Global Affairs program at the German Council on Foreign Relations, known also in German by its initials DGAP. He previously worked at Aspen, Germany, where as Deputy Executive Director and Fellow, he was responsible for the Institute's digital and transatlantic programs. And prior to that, Tyson served in numerous positions, including as a senior advisor in the Bureau for European and Eurasian Affairs at the US State Department and Director for Transatlantic Relations at the Bertelsmann Foundation. He has a bachelor's degree from Columbia and a master's degree from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. So today, each speaker will provide about 5 to 7 minutes of opening remarks, which will then be followed by a conversation that I look forward to leading among them. And then I want to open up the floor to questions from all of you who are watching today. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A button. Also, please, as much as possible, try to pose it briefly and in the form of a question. And just as was mentioned, I should mention that we're recording this event and we'll also post it on our website for those of you who wish to view it later. So Anna Christmann, let me turn to you to lead off today's discussion with a view from the German government and the German parliament.
Yeah, thank you so much, Peter. I'm very happy to be part of this round here, and I'm looking forward to our discussion. And I'm happy to begin with some remarks from the German parliament and government in a way, because I kind of combine two roles in one person. And maybe I start with 3 very simple statements and about like the role of AI in Germany's and also Europe's politics. Because first of all, I think we see AI as a very important technology to solve the global challenges like climate crisis, social challenges like the pandemic right now. We see AI as a key technology to tackle all these questions. And that is one important motivation for learning and applying this technology. The second point is that we also have ethical questions that are related to AI, that we also, from our perspective, need some rules to guarantee that AI works according our values in Europe and as human beings. And the third point, in a way, is related to the first 2 points. That is, in order to be able to guarantee the first point that we tackle social and global challenges with AI, and the second, that we guarantee the ethical dimension. Therefore, we need to be excellent in the technology, and we need the know-how, and we need the people who now know how to develop this technology. And this is the motivation why I am saying it is very important that we also in Europe are an excellent place to develop and apply AI technologies. And that is why I also see it very important that we have this transatlantic discussion and also collaboration on a technology like AI, because it is so important and has so much impact on the way our planet is working, and we as human beings are going to living in the future. And you mentioned in the beginning, AI is an emerging technology. I would say AI is a technology that is already there. It's everywhere, more or less. We use it every day in our mobile phones, and it's also has already a big impact on our lives. So that is the framework where we're in, and that is why Europe and German and the new government is very much engaged in the issues of the development of AI. And maybe the first aspect, developing the technology, is we invest a lot in research on AI, and we have in fact a rising centers for AI in Europe and especially in Germany. We just started, especially with the land Baden-Württemberg in the south of Germany. There is a new institute called Alice Institute in the Stuttgart-Tübingen region, where lots of private money is invested right now, and where kind of a European network in research and science is developing right now, and kind of a center where also startups and big firms, also Amazon, come together and have a place where really interesting people come together and develop this technology. So investments in research is one very important pillar of our policies. And of course, the second one is to try to support also startups, but also SMEs to really get into using AI and using also the data that is useful for it. We see that especially smaller firms, they aren't always aware what they could do with their data. And we want to support them to get the expertise and the ideas how they can really profit from their data. And especially because compared to the US, we don't have so much personal data from social media firms. That is something that is more typical for the US. We have Google here in this round, but we have lots of industrial data in Germany and in Europe. We have the industry 4.0, how it is called in Germany. And we should really make more use of these kind of data, and especially in the sector also for which is relevant for Energiewende, for example. We could do much more to make windcraft more efficient, to learn more about how solar panels work and with which weather conditions. All of these kind of data we need a better use. So supporting SMEs, smaller firms, bringing them together with bigger companies, and trying to find a data strategy that also makes more use of data that is there, but is not used enough. So this is the supporting pillar. And then we have, of course, in Europe, the whole discussion about the new regulation, about the AI Act, which we support from the German government. And I think there are also two aspects that are very important. The one is to be very clear about the red lines where we don't want to use AI, and that is in biometric recognition without any course in a massive way. That is something we don't want in Europe. And that is also social scoring, like we see it in some parts of the world in the public sector, where the state uses information about people and makes it a factor for being able to use public services or things like that. So these are kinds of things we want to really prohibit in Europe, and I think that's good. And then on the other way, it's also important that we have rules that are easy for startups, for SMEs to also be able to have really an innovation system where AI can be used, can be developed. So it doesn't make any sense to make it too strict and to give any rules that can't really be fulfilled about like specific data sets or something. So there we just right now try to find the right line where we have these clear things that should be prohibited, but also rules that are easy for firms to fulfill to be able to have a good ecosystem. So I think that is kind of the framework where we work in Germany on AI. And I think it's very important that we go this way in the next years, keeping investing in the technology, bringing the people together that are able to develop the strategy, and also, of course, building collaborations on a global scale. Europe, I think, is for us an important scale, but also globally, of course, to have also more cooperations with the US and other countries. And I think that it's going to be very important to get kind of a global framework with clear rules and clear ideas where we can make really use of the innovations that are possible by AI to fight climate crisis and all these things. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anna. That was fascinating. I think especially your emphasis on the one hand, the need to make data available, for example, to SMEs, but on the other hand, to make sure you're protecting that data from misuse. So I think that's an interesting tension that we can explore further. Charina Chou, how do you see things?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Really glad to join the discussion. I think I would just echo, to start points that Anna and Bastien and you made at the beginning, right? This idea that AI is a transformative technology. Absolutely. So this is a very important conversation to have. I'll share from the Google perspective, AI has absolutely transformed our business. In fact, every single day with Google search, 15% of searches are new every single day. And so this is something we would not be able to hand code the answers to, right? 20 plus years ago, you could maybe say like, if somebody searches for coffee, right, then, show XYZ results. That's just not possible today because we can't predict all the things people will ask. The queries are more challenging. People are no longer just searching in English or even German or Spanish. They're searching in hundreds of languages, and all the content on the web is quite diverse and quite varied every single day, right? So you've got not just text today, you've got images and video and audio and all sorts of things. So at Google, in order to deliver on our own mission as a company, we've absolutely had to move to artificial intelligence, machine learning techniques. That being said, right, we know that we're working on hard problems, but they're really just a fraction of all the different ways we're seeing AI applied across the world, right? Transportation and delivery, increasing security, addressing fraud, agricultural efficiency, health, sustainability. A lot of those points that Anna mentioned as well, like there's so much opportunity here. I think we're really recognizing at Google, in many other organizations around the world, a lot of people recognizing the importance of AI, the opportunities of AI, and then also trying to figure out the best ways to drive responsible innovation. So with that, there are so many different directions that we could go in, right? There's infinite work to do. So how do you actually drive progress on this, knowing that there's limited resources? It seems like collaboration is obviously the answer. We've got to work together. People talk about working across sectors. I think Audrey Tang from Taiwan has a phrase, people, public, private partnerships. So we've been thinking a lot about, what is Google's role? What is the private sector's role? But also what role does government need to play? And what about civil society, academia, and all the others, right? And then also, how do we collaborate between countries? Like, again, knowing that there's limited resources. I think, Anna brought up the pandemic as well, even more so, we're limited. So how do we partner on things and really kind of maximize output? And I would say two things that we really see from Google. I think the first that we've got to work together on is really support for research, development, and implementation. So if you look at what's actually needed for machine learning, right, you need data, you need algorithms, you need compute, and you need talent. So what are the different roles of the different sectors and the different countries to contribute to that, right? So on data, again, Anna brought up this point, but how do we share more open data? There's a lot of data, comes with weather data, air quality, transportation, a lot of things that governments have, a lot of things that the private sector has. I know we've unlocked a lot of things like translation data, computer vision data sets. And we have over 100 data sets that are completely open on the Google website, really thinking if we can kind of share where the data is protected and really provide opportunity for everybody to learn from those things, that puts the entire world kind of in a better position. How do we think about, the role of governments or other organizations in driving the development of new data sets? A lot of things we could talk about there, right? Same with algorithms. When it comes to compute, I'll just share a couple of thoughts. A lot of times people talk about AI and they think, oh, software and new algorithms, which is absolutely true, but all of those algorithms have to perform on chips, right? You need hardware, you need silicon to be able to process these algorithms. So what are the ways that we partner together on that? At Google, for example, we've been doing a lot of work over the last 5-6 years to design new chips, tailored silicon chips for machine learning, right? But, what are, various things that other organizations are doing? How do governments think about securing supply chains? All of those things are going to be critical to the development of AI. And then kind of another point on talent, right? I started at Google at the end of 2014. And at that time, actually fewer than 5% of employees had machine learning training. We've had to really ramp that up over the last 5 to 7 years. I think since then, we've had 60,000 people internally go through machine learning training because we need it in our systems and in our products. We actually open source that education into 11 languages, and now more than 1 million people have taken that externally. So thinking about, okay, again, where can the private sector contribute? Where does government and others all play a role to develop the workforce that we need to use and take advantage of AI? And then I'll note, right, the research, development, implementation, that also includes research into tough, responsible development problems, right? Anna Bastian both mentioned this point on, hey, we've got to think about ethical development, responsible development. That's absolutely critical. We launched a new machine learning system in Google Translate in 2017, and it resulted in the biggest improvement gains in 12 plus years to Google Translate. That said, once we launched it, it was great, but there were still a lot of questions. I think a lot of people tried to break it on the outside, and we had an interesting report filed from a user saying, well, I inputted knife, fork, knife in German. I think people were just putting in kind of funny things to try to break the system. Knife, comma, fork, comma, knife in German. And when it translated into English, it translated spoon, 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 spoon. And we got like 100 spoons. And it was funny, but we also couldn't figure out immediately why that had happened, right? And that's just a funny example, but there's a lot of new questions that come with the implementation of new technology. So how do we develop research? How do we develop better implementation to think about explainability, privacy, security, all of those questions to really ensure responsible development of the technology? So yeah, working together on responsible development, and then coming with that, AI rules. So how do we think about operationalizing common principles based on democratic values? You look around, Google certainly released a set of AI principles in 2018. We've seen lots of these principles from various organizations, right? The EU also had wonderful communication on this. Look at the principles. I think people are generally in agreement, right? Everybody wants fairness, everybody wants privacy, security, all of those things. The challenge is when some of those items start to come into conflict with each other. They are in tension at times. How do you make decisions? What does that mean to actually implement fairness, things like that? How do we think about harmonizing risk-based proportional AI regulation? AI Act, the proposal there is a really good first step forward. How do we identify red lines while also being clear, right? Anna brought up this point around, facial recognition. How do we think about really restricting the red line use cases while thinking about how we use the technology also to help find missing kids or support people with autism or vision impairment? So just a lot of important questions there. I think we've all got to work together on common standards and benchmarks, and then just responsible adoption of AI by all of the world, right? Civil society, small businesses, larger companies, governments. Again, a lot of opportunities, but work we've got to do together.
Thank you, Charina. I think the last thing you said there about principles is quite interesting, and how we translate principles into action. I think that's kind of where we all are right now. You mentioned the Google principles. I know I've read those, and also, of course, in the official level, the OECD and the G20 have principles. But I think when we talk about the US and Germany, US and EU, maybe I think we want to start thinking about how we do translate those into action. Tyson, perhaps you have some things to say about that, or some other aspects of the issue. Over to you.
Thank you so much. It's good to round this up, because I've had some excellent speakers before me that have put a lot on the table. I mean, there's a lot to respond to. And thanks to AI-CGS and to the Bull Stiftung for the invitation. I can't think of a better context to have this conversation, not just because the US and Europe are now working together on this very topic in the Trade and Technology Council, but when you also think about the size of some of those inputs that were just mentioned. I mean, just to give you some sense, we always talk about the US and China when we talk about AI, and it's true. The US has 20% of global researchers and produces 10,000 academic papers a year, and China has 29% of global researchers and produces 15,000 academic papers a year. But Europe has 18% of global researchers and produces 15,000 academic papers a year. So if we're talking about the content of talent, the kind of proportion of talent, they're very similar. Actually, the United States and Europe have around the same amount of AI startups founded every year. There are some differences, obviously, in the next steps. We do have in the United States some larger players, and that influences and impacts perception. But at least on the side of innovation, they're very similarly structured. What I think is really interesting, because I think we're all kind of policy nerds, is to talk a little bit about the policy side of things. And what's great about what's happening right now between the US and Europe is so much convergence on AI policy and the policy that kind of enables AI. So we have a lot of convergence on data protection. And I know that doesn't seem this way in this acute, very difficult moment, but we have it. On taxation, on content moderation, on the market power of online platforms, and again, on a risk-based approach to AI standards and regulation. And if you look at what's happening in the United States and Europe, you see some common themes. Both sides are trying to limit state overreach. And you see this from everything from law enforcement to social scoring to discussions of facial recognition, et cetera. And both processes are deeply informed by use cases that are happening in China. And that's a big difference geopolitically from what we've seen, for example, in the area of platform regulation or data protection, which had different, let's say, points of reference than the AI policy discourse. And finally, we're grafting together a kind of Rosetta Stone within international cooperation bodies on what the principles are that we want to use in the OECD, in the Global Partnership for AI, which I should mention is, of course, was launched through the G7. It was French and Canadians took that up in the G7, in the UN, and of course now in the TTC. Maybe a couple of points on where there are slight process differences between the US and Europe. And if I have time, I'll talk about what we can do together in the TTC or between Germany and the United States, but perhaps we save that for discussion. So the US, typical to its nature in some ways, is again approaching this in a more bottom-up, more sector-driven approach. It's a little more mission-driven, but it is still creating a tapestry of high-risk AI. And we see this, it's very similar to what happened with data protection governance in the United States. So we are a little bit behind what's happening in Europe. Regulators right now in the United States are using existing authorities to create rules. You see this with HUD on discrimination in housing. We see this in financial services sector, et cetera. And as was mentioned by the colleague from Google, we're seeing a lot of private sector actors driving the principles that they want to say, this is how we're going to limit ourselves. These are the kind of ethics that we're being bound by. And that's informing the process in the United States and globally. Third, the national security community is really a driver of this conversation in the United States, both in terms of thinking strategically in the context of the US-China tech competition, but also in terms of its resources for innovation, and even creating broad guidelines for strategy. We see this with the National Security Commission on AI, which was led by Eric Schmidt, the third offset process, which led to the Defense Innovation Unit and Board, and even in Pentagon contracting, and of course in DARPA. And then a big potential interlocutor for cooperation are subnational state actors in the United States, states and cities. They're really the ones driving from the ground up the regulatory process. And usually, and this is again a common misnomer, they tend to be the places that are at the forefront of innovation itself. So it's San Francisco, it's Boston, it's New York that are putting moratoriums on facial recognition for body cams, for use of facial recognition in schools. It's Virginia, Massachusetts. These are the ones talking about how to limit the use of biometric data, real-time biometric data in law enforcement settings. And what we're seeing with the Biden administration is a real push to operationalize, to get to that action point with executive authority, both through this new AI Bill of Rights, which would limit the role of the state, and this is a great place for US-European cooperation, the NIST AI risk management framework, which is a process that just started, but really focuses the whole of government mind on the question of how should we assess risk across sectors. And there's a big process going on. And I think that that's one of the reasons why this is so fruitful for US-European cooperation. I'll just have a couple of words on the AI Act and what's happening in Europe, and then we'll leave the rest for the discussion and Q&A. Europe is in many ways approaching it in a European way, which is great. They are taking a much more ethics-based approach to AI regulation. It is more horizontal than the sectoral-based approach that's happening in the United States. And it follows a kind of European method that kind of evolved out of their experience with GDPR. There are attempts to learn from the GDPR process with regards to national authorities, how independent they should be, what happens when national authorities are not are not enforcing regulation appropriately. So there are debates around that, but generally there's a kind of similar structure you see with GDPR. You have a European Artificial Intelligence Board, which is similar to European Data Protection Board, et cetera. Still, there are questions around definitions. What constitutes AI? Because many people would interpret some of what is in the AI Act as basically talking about software generally. And what are the limits, and how is it related to actual use cases and impact of outcomes and the nature and scope of decisions? And then another question, and it's ripe for discussion between the US and Europe, is the question around explainability. Because a lot of times we're layering data sets upon data sets and algorithms upon algorithms so that explainability becomes very difficult, even as the outcomes become more effective and in some cases more fair. So how do we deal with that? So with that, I know we've got 30 minutes. I will leave it there. I've got a ton of ideas on how the TTC could work together, how Germany and the US could work together, but I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Tyson. Well, since you mentioned the TTC, let me follow it up with the question about its role in the future. We saw at the September meeting in Pittsburgh that AI was a big part of the discussions there, and I think we can imagine it'll be a big part of the next meeting, which is supposed to take place this spring in Europe. And then when we look at the new German government, AI is mentioned fairly prominently in the coalition agreement, including the importance of stepping up transatlantic dialogue with the US on AI. So I guess one question I have is kind of where will this dialogue happen? I mean, is it going to be all about the TTC and the EU level, or rather, when we're talking about innovation especially, and because of the Germany's strong research role, I mean, how much will be sort of the US talking to Germany, and how much should be the US talking to the EU, and where should the division of labor be on that issue?
Is that for me?
Sure, Tyson, why not?
Oh, or for the Germans. Well, I think it's in all of the above, clearly. But there is, we should say, some inflection, some accents when you look at the difference between regulatory policy, which is kind of aggregating to Brussels, and innovation policy, which is still, it's multi-layered, but still much more focused on member states, and in many cases actually subnational. So for example, the state of Baden-Württemberg, which is kind of a guiding light for AI innovation in Europe, generally, is a perfect place to create subnational cooperation. And I know that, for example, Baden-Württemberg is working very closely with the state of California. So, you know, that might be one place to start to get that division of labor. It's a little different in the United States because you do have more top-down innovation and industrial policy, as we're seeing with the CHIPS Act, for example. But I do think that that's the general place to start. One thing I will mention as we go into the TTC discussion is it would be great to have greater German buy-in to the TTC process. You mentioned the coalition agreement. There was a statement in that agreement about where the US and Germany should cooperate on data sovereignty, on net freedom, and on artificial intelligence, all super important. But it didn't mention this key council, the Trade and Technology Council, created by the European Commission to foster a kind of Euro-Atlantic tech alliance that really incubates and allows for our values to be global values in the digital space, in the digital world. So getting Germany to really full-throatedly endorse that will be an important first step in that German-American relationship.
Anna, I think I should turn it over to you now to follow Tyson's question there.
Yeah, thank you so much. First of all, I'm very happy Tyson mentioning Baden-Württemberg as one of the places in Germany where really many things are happening around AI. And I think it's a little bit comparable to what you said about the US, that we have like the states as innovation drivers. And maybe that's also because In Germany, compared to the US, we have more investments to the universities and to the research institutes, to public research institutes that work on AI on a really high expertise level, compared maybe to the US, where much of the research is happening in the big companies such as Google, Facebook, Amazon, etc., that all have a very big AI research section. We don't have these kind of big companies in Europe and in Germany that are doing research on AI. So in Germany, it's much more happening in the universities, in the Max Planck Institutes, things like that. So that is where the money is going, and the states are the ones who finance these kind of public research institutes to a large extent. So the states are really important players in Germany for the financing of AI research. And of course, I'm happy, as I am from Stuttgart, that this is a place where really lots of things are happening right now. And I think there's kind of what I mentioned, a place where many things that are relevant for whole Europe are starting kind of in Baden-Württemberg. And Baden-Württemberg is very much engaged also in bringing these European research teams together and really shape something like European AI. And I think that is very important. And of course, it is also something that the government in Berlin now wants to take up more maybe than before, because that was always something that I was expecting already from the former government more, that they really engage in a kind of a very strong European way of developing and investing in AI and engaging in global dialogues on this technology. And that is what Tyson mentioned. I think we can do more from Germany, and that is what we want to start now more and more, to really be part of these global collaborations, cooperations, and to find joint answers on very difficult questions from a way to have on the policy side, what was mentioned. But I think there are some things that we have in common. And also from the question how we can bring talents together and really work together on the problems, because we have in a way only global problems that we want to solve. And I think collaboration is really important, and rules for AI aren't European, aren't American, they should be global. So I think the German government could do more, and we plan to do more, and I will be happy to be part of this.
Charina, from Google's experience and perspective, do you have a view of where the value is in terms of US cooperation with Germany versus cooperation kind of at a broader EU level?
Yeah, I think that our view is honestly, as many people and as many kind of connections, having this conversation is a good way to go. So to the degree that Max Planck was mentioned, and other, like, we see a lot of really great work happening in Germany, right? Phenomenal research. Can we collaborate, for example, research to research? I know there's a lot of things the U.S. is even learning about innovation policy and good actions around, Germany tends to, I think, invest in a lot of people and like talent and great ideas, versus in the US has been around more the specific projects and maybe dependent on a little bit more of the kind of incremental thinking of, what will get you a grant. And so looking at things that we can learn from country to country, I think is a good thing. At the same time, we've got to work, I think, US and EU at this level to really identify some of the specifics, right? What are the right ways to have global governance? The more the large regions are all kind of in it together, I think that's going to drive more innovation and more kind of common understanding around the use of the technology. Getting specific too around, I think Tyson mentioned the NIST, risk management framework, right? Like what should actually be included in that specifically? How do you think about explainability? What actually needs to be explained? In many ways, Tyson talked about how with AI systems, maybe you can even get to better results, but you don't really understand what's happening. In many ways, we know that a lot of decisions that are made today by humans, like we also don't really understand how humans are coming to those decisions and assessments. So where and how much explainability is needed, but also across all these other elements. How do we think about the responsibilities of everyone in the AI value chain? So people who are kind of developing AI technologies versus, then third parties and businesses who are using it and applying it to their customers versus the end customers. There's a lot of different players in the ecosystem. So, really working out the responsibilities there, identifying common standards and benchmarks. I mean, there is a lot of kind of activity in this space and kind of opportunity to bring in other players as well, right? Tyson mentioned the global partnership on AI. There's also kind of ISO and IEEE and a lot of these other bodies that are thinking even internationally about common benchmarks. So how do we work through those where it makes sense? And then again, identifying ways to collaborate on open data, on models, on talent exchange and chips.
Thanks. You know, we hear from time to time from the EU the idea that it should develop more strategic autonomy, and you know, that it should have sort of somehow be a more sovereign actor in the world, also in the technology domain. And it seems that Germany and a number of other European governments would like to encourage, you know, the creation of domestic sort of tech champions, including in the AI space. How do you see the implications of this line of thought, this strategic autonomy way of thinking? You know, what's the potential impact you could have on both US EU trade in AI products and services, but also in the emergence of an efficient and ethical transatlantic AI ecosystem? Do you see, is there a contradiction there, or can EU strategic sovereignty in strategic autonomy and technology go hand in hand with transatlantic cooperation? Anna, maybe you would like to. Thanks. Yeah.
If I may, yeah, sure. I think the point of sovereignty is very important for Europe, and it's important because it's like the baseline for cooperation and collaboration with partners like the US and other countries, because we need kind of our own expertise, we need the people, we need the talents, we need the companies that are able to cooperate, to collaborate with other companies on the world on the same level. It doesn't make any sense, and it's also less interesting, I guess, for partners to work with Europe where nothing is happening. Like to have the idea when we are a place where we don't have any development on AI or any expertise, it wouldn't be interesting for anyone to cooperate with Europe, and it would be dramatically difficult to set any rules for where we want to use AI, because we would be completely dependent from the decisions that are made in other parts of the world. So I think sovereignty for Europe is a big issue, is an important issue, but it is not a contradiction, but it's like the entry to the collaboration that should happen on a worldwide scale, and it should come together with more engagement also in partnerships, because research and development is always collaborative. It's always better if you have exchange, if you have things like open source, open data policies where you really can profit from each other, but you need to have a known strength to be really a partner in this collaboration that makes sense for both sides and to make it fruitful. So that is why I'm so engaged in making this kind of AI made in Europe happen, to have this baseline for these kind of collaborations. And but I don't think it's not that we should do the first step and then after 10 years we do the second step. Now we should do it at the same time, but it depends on each other in a way. So that's how I see it.
Charina or Tyson, any thoughts on that?
I can jump in. Yeah, I think that's right. Wherever countries, governments want to invest in expertise and leadership, that's a good thing. So I really welcome a lot of that. I think I would just make 2 points. First, there really is a lot of work to do in AI. And so how to think about where different expertise might complement each other rather than a need to recreate the wheel. That is certainly something where we can think about working with each other's strengths. Just to give one example, right, with you know, a lot of the machine learning tools and technologies, APIs that have been developed right at Google. Say we invest quite a lot in terms of developing computer vision systems and open data sets for images, right? I think a couple years ago, we identified in a lot of the image data sets, actually, if you looked up something like bride, it was always like a woman in a white veil and white dress. And actually quite, you know, that's not necessarily the picture of brides all around the world. And so we invested quite a lot working with users all around the world to really bolster up up a data set, and I think it's got, millions and millions of images. We made it open, kind of shared transparency around what's in the data set. There's really no need for everybody, I think, to recreate the same data set, but where do we have data that complements each other, where we can share and kind of, as Anna said, kind of be on equal footing to kind of exchange ideas and really come up with something even better when we put those strengths together. The other point I'd make is just to note, some problems really are international problems. So even in the thinking about digital sovereignty or national leadership, right, we've worked with a number of organizations, one around kind of flood forecasting. How do you, floods are very deadly occurrence, getting worse with climate change. How do you think about kind of even detecting or predicting some of these things earlier, ahead of times? One of the things we noted, of course, you've got to have data to learn and build better models. The water doesn't know country borders, right? So where countries think about actually, are we able to share things across countries and actually share kind of our common knowledge, we could result in much better models that would save millions of lives around the world. And so just thinking about how we, as you said, Peter, don't have these two items kind of contradict each other, but where there's national development and sovereignty and leadership and all of these things, but where it collaborates and really complements a lot of the other work that's happening around the world.
Great, thanks. Well, let me turn to some questions from our viewers. One of them has to do with intellectual property. And the questioner says there's a lot of discussion on collaboration and cross-sector integration, which is critical. But the questioner sees some tensions developing between, or at least potentially developing between strong IP protections and the use and sharing of data, both in the US and Europe, and especially as regards trade secrets. And so the question is, do you any of you see an intentional shift away from IP protection in favor of other policies in order to drive innovation, including in AI? And are other regulatory frameworks better able to promote collaboration and still provide rewards for commercial innovation? We'd like to tackle that one. Tyson.
I can start with a little something. I mean, there are definitely, if you look at, for example, the German coalition agreement, and Anna mentioned this as well, there are new incentives for open source software development, including procurement incentives. So there is an effort right now to create a more collaborative, open environment for developing algorithms and artificial intelligence. There is also, it should be said, within the AI Act, and I think that this will probably be the case, frankly, in regulatory regimes all over the world, definitely in China, also, but in the European Union as well, to have need for disclosure of algorithms, of source code, in order to evaluate, what is, the efficacy and that it's abiding by the principles that are established in the regulation. The question is, are the guardrails in place to make sure that that's not abused, that it's narrowly targeted, that it's proportional, that it has all sorts of redress mechanisms to make sure that companies' trade secrets are being protected. But these are tendencies that are starting to occur, yes.
Maybe let me just add one sentence more or less. I think it's a misunderstanding that open source means it's not profitable. Open source is a very important way of making money, because you have lots of services that are needed around it. It's much more than like the source code to provide AI technologies or to provide functional software. So that is why we exactly have done this, that we have a focus on also open source, open innovation issues in our coalition. And I think that is a very good way to share like innovative ideas and also to make money by it. So it's I think it's a misunderstanding that open source is automatically not a way to make money.
We have another question. The questioner says, with no federal data law currently in the US, how is the US going to develop its own AI Act similar to the one that the EU has without a data privacy law in place in the first place, the way that the EU has GDPR? In other words, is something like GDPR absolutely necessary to have in the United States as well in order to develop its own comprehensive AI Act. Anyone like to take a stab?
I can add a few comments.
Sure, thanks, Charina.
Certainly seems like Google has been advocating for a federal data privacy law for more than a decade, but we're hopeful, but I can't say that we're optimistic that we expect to see something like this in the US. That being said, I think we're seeing a lot of activity from various agencies around the administration, really thinking about how they implement AI and do so responsibly within the missions of their agencies. Tyson earlier mentioned the White House's AI Bill of Rights initiative. I'm certainly seeing elements from NIST and others. So I don't know. I think one of the places where we see the US can make progress, at least, is in really driving good practices and good sharing of like how to really implement this kind of work. So the NIST risk management framework, I think, is going to be an important step in that direction. If all the agencies can also then start to think about implementing that, I know industry and private sector thinking about how we share our own responsible practices as well. We actually at Google have a website, Google AI, and we kind of update our responsible practices every quarter. So that's certainly something I think every sector is going to play a role, but I'm not clear whether how the US may take federal action here.
Okay, thanks. Let me shift the conversation just a little bit and maybe ask you, Anna. Right now, Germany has the presidency of the G7. We've talked a lot about the transatlantic context. We've talked about the bilateral US-German context. I think Germany has 5 leading issues it wants to promote with its G7 presidency. Do you think there's also a role for Germany to lead on AI within that context, given that if you look at the current members of the G7, they are quite like-minded in a number of these ethical and values issues?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think with the G7 presidency, we have some issues, some ideas from the German side, how we can engage in, I would say, AI-related areas. One of that is data. We really want to engage in a way to foster cross-border data exchange. That is one important issue, I think, and that really addresses what I've been saying before this evening, that we really should make more of our data that we have in different societies, because they are so important to really solve problems, and data don't stop at any borders, but it really makes sense to share them and to make more of them. And that is one thing that we also plan for the G7 presidency, as well as the issue of setting standards and norms. And that is maybe an important point also on the topic of AI, because Germany is very much engaged in getting to some AI standards and norms. And I think there's a very interesting field, because then it's not a regulation, but it's a question of, do we have different standards, different norms that you can just check for? What kind of AI do we have? Can we find norms and standard for explainability, for example, to say, okay, when we use AI in the public sector, it might need to fulfill a higher explainable standards than when we use it in industry or in machines or something like that. Or do we have standards for energy efficiency? Because we can also have different kind of AI algorithms that are more or less efficient, and that could also be a norm or a standard that you can see, okay, this is a very efficient, so in a way, green AI algorithm. These kind of standards and norms are, from our perspective, a very important factor for the development of AI, because then you can really make it comparable, and you can make users, or you can make companies able to identify what kind of AI, so to say, they want to use or not use. And you don't have to do everything by regulation, but you can really go the way to find standards and norms. And that is also something that Germany traditionally is very much engaged also in other technologies. So now we really want to bring our expertise into the field of AI there.
Okay. We have one question. It drills down and gets a bit more specific, but I think it's an important one. The questioner asks, where do you see future research in AI developing most fruitfully when we think about US, German, and US EU collaboration? What should be the maybe 1 or 2 priority areas for transatlantic collaboration on AI research? Tyson?
I'm sure Charina has many ideas as well. But one area I see, and also just looking at this from the policy side, are things around non-personally identifiable information. So AI in kind of IoT contexts and industrial contexts, and specifically integrated systems, hardware, software, data in new kind of arrangements like we're seeing, or we will see, as cloud computing moves more to the edge, as you have much more diffuse kind of digital architecture, digital infrastructure in countries, which will change the kind of consortia that we have traditionally had in collaboration. So I think that that is an area that is well primed for European American cooperation, German American cooperation, and also is a great area to start thinking about politically now, rather than waiting until, you know, the die is cast a little bit on what we think should happen on both sides of the Atlantic and things are a little bit more divergent.
I'll add a couple thoughts.
Yeah.
Honestly, I could share a lot. It's hard to pick 1 or 2, but I'll pick 2. The first, kind of picking up on what Tyson said, you know, a lot of times people think that there is a conflict between privacy and kind of, you know, new AI tools and insights and things like that. And in fact, there's a lot of research that's going into areas like differential privacy, federated learning, synthetic data, elements like that, where, hey, you can actually have both and, right? You get your cake and you eat it too. So how can we work together to really invest in areas like that? You know, thinking about rules and principles, sometimes people feel like, oh, they're constricting. But in fact, in many ways, if you've got the right rules and principles, you can drive much more innovation. I think that we could see a lot of innovation in the privacy space, for example, a lot of others to talk about as well. And then just the second I'll note is sustainability. Really seems like such a big opportunity here. US cares about it. Obviously, the EU and certainly Germany cares about this a lot. So how do we work together and really identify ways to kind of mitigate climate change, to deal with it, but also, you know, identify new materials, better solar cells, all of those kinds of things. Seems like a pretty big opportunity.
Anna, maybe the last word for you.
I could just perfectly add to Charina that, of course, sustainability, climate, these are really issues that maybe a little bit typical Europe. It should be typical for the whole world, but maybe Europe is especially engaged. And I think that is also something that Europe really can bring in. And maybe also I'd like to emphasize what Charina said, that regulation can also be a driver for innovation, to find ways to use AI in a way that is compatible to the rules we're going to have in Europe, to the question of data privacy, to the question of energy efficiency. So the challenge is to find solutions to make AI work with these kind of rules and framework. And I think that is something that really can come from Europe, and that is something that Europe really can bring in the global question of the AI development.
Well, Anna Christmann, Charina Chou, Tyson Barker, thank you, all 3 of you, for contributing to this conversation, which I think has helped to drive forward some ideas on the transatlantic collaboration on AI innovation. And let me also thank the Heinrich Böll Foundation for their excellent cooperation on this event, and also thank all of you who tuned in today and for your questions. We will post this recording of this event on our website if you'd like to see it again, and we will also continue to work on AI in the coming year. So we look forward to having you back for those and other events at AI CGS. So thanks a lot. Have a good day, all of you, and good evening. Bye-bye.